Welcome back to session 3 for Unit ICT PRG 414, Introduction to C#. Now, this one we will be covering switch, loops, while and for, break continue, arrays, and give us an alternative way of producing output. So, just a quick recap on the last theory session. We went through user input, a little bit more depth into the various operators. Hopefully you remember that to look up the Microsoft Docs on C# to have a more in-depth look into that. We basically just went over the arithmetic and Boolean functions in a little bit detail, and that's the next 2 points there. Maths, strings, a little bit more detail on various ways of manipulating string values, and a look at the if statements. So let's have a look at the switch. So the switch allows us to cut between the modes a little differently. So we have an expression which is the condition we want to meet against, and what we're comparing is the various cases against the expression. So as it goes through, when it gets a match against the case line against the expression, it'll run that block of code. The break takes it out of the switch method and brings you to the next statement line to be run. With the default, which is optional, we run down through here. We don't get any matches against the case scenarios we've laid out. This block will be run if there's no explicit match, and then breaks it out. So basically went through the break and default keywords there. So breaks means to stop executing the code and leave the switch method. And then we have the default, which is executed if no match is found, which doesn't have to be within the switch method. It's optional. So with our loops, we'll be looking at a couple of different ones, but we basically want to continually run a set of code whilst the condition is true. So if you come down into here, we evaluate the condition, and if the condition is true, we come into the block to be executed, and then come back and reevaluate, see if the condition is still true, continue that loop while that condition is true. Once it becomes false, we break out to the next statement or the next method, whichever terminology you want to run across. Slight variation of that is with the do while loop. This allows us to run through the sequence of code at least once, even if the condition is false. So we're going to do, and I shouldn't click on the slideshow while I'm chatting. We want to do the function, so we want to run that code block, and then evaluate the condition. And if the condition is true, it'll continue to do the loop. If it's false, it's already executed that once, and then it will move on. So it's a slight different variation. So it's one way of getting that block. With the for loops, this is a little bit different. So we come in with the initial value and we need to evaluate that condition. So if the condition is true, we'll execute the code, we'll increment the counter and loop back up. We do that until the condition is false, and then we move on to the next one. So the syntax is for statement 1, statement 2, statement 3, and the blocker code to be executed for the conditions. So statement 1 is the condition to be executed once before the code block is run. Statement 2 defines the condition for the loop to occur, and statement 3 is our incremental step. The next loop is the for each loop. Now this runs with arrays. So the syntax is for each, the data type, variable name in array, and run the code. So the type can be a string, it can be an integer, whatever data type is stored in the variable array. So in the example here we have an array called cars, which is a bunch of string variables. So for each string I in cars, we'll console write line I. So Toyota will be printed, then Nissan, then Mazda, and then there's no other variables laid out in the array. That will stop and move on. We can use the break statement in loops, just like we did with the switch statements. And there's another one called continue. Now, if you add continue in, it basically makes it skip a round of the loop. So when the condition is met and you have a continue statement there, it'll actually skip the next round and increment up. So for integer I equals 0, and statement 2 is the condition while I is less than 7, and the increment is I plus plus, so it's incrementing I by 1. So if I is equal to 4, or not equal to 4, break, and continue over here. So if that is true, it'll skip and then go through again. Have a play, see what you think. Okay, arrays. Now, as you saw in the last example, an array is a variable that contains multiple values. We define that variable as an array by putting the 2 square brackets in. we then put the values inside a set of braces separated by commas. Each position within the array, so each value, has an index number, and we can use that element number or index number so to call out just that particular value, or we can edit, delete based on that index number. So each element, which is a value, can be manipulated by itself as long as we know the correct index number for it. So in the example here at the bottom, cars 3, so we don't have a value 3, so it's inserting a new value, and so it's inserting 4 into that array. So if we want to use the array with the for loop, we need to know how many times to run it through, because a for needs an explicit countdown to use. So it needs to know the length of the array, how many values there are. So to do that, just like with the string property, we can use the length to derive a count. So in this case, length would be 3. So as long as I is less than 3, we'll print it out. This, if we want to loop and we're not sure how many values there are, and we might be adding or subtracting into this over the duration, it may be better to use the for each loop, because that way it'll just continue through them all regardless of how many there is in the array. Now, just because they've been entered in a certain order doesn't necessarily mean that's the way you want them to stay. So we can sort them in alphabetical or ascending order by using the sort method. So on the left, we're sorting a bunch of numbers, array sort unnum, and then we're writing them out with a for each loop in ascending order. On the right hand side, we're doing it with the array cars. We're going to sort the array and then print them out in alphabetical order. So it'll be Mazda, Nissan, Toyota. Now, to do some other mathematical equations dealing with arrays, we may want to use the systemling namespace methods. So within that namespace we have min, max and sum, which we can use to extract a straight value out of the array. So that way we don't have to dump the arrays out into individual values to find out which one's smallest or whatever it is that we want to do with it. So to make use of these, we add the using system.ling to the top of the program, and that way we can sort the array, use these functions in the array without having to specifically specify where the method is coming from. We can just put what we want to function in. So here you can see, using emitted content here, using system, then underneath it using systemling, and then the rest of the code where you set up the array, and then we've got console write line unnumbered.max. So what we're saying is we're going to put the maximum value as the output. Now, there are multiple ways of adding arrays into your program. The way that we used in the previous examples down the bottom, so we did this, the function call of the string, put the brackets in, cars, and then just put the values in. We didn't specify how many elements there was going to be, or that it was a new string addition. Now that becomes important later on when we use this value. If we create the array but don't put any values in it, but want to add the values later, we've got to make sure we use cars equal new string and then add them in. We can't do it any other way unless we use the new string. The next example here, we are specifying the string and we're saying how many elements are in this array and then putting in the values. Next example here is we're defining the array, but we're not specifying the size. So as I said, if you use the system of setting up the array without adding any values in at the time of creation, and you want to come back to it, you must use the cars equals new string and put it in. If you do not use this format when you want to add the values in later, it'll produce an error and break your code. Almost finished with this session's theory. So we want to use variables and text to produce an output. Now, when we did this, when we did the, adding, so C equals A plus B equals, then close the quotes, put it, add the variable, then add some more text to say add, then an add the variable, then the add equals in quotes, then add the variable. We're diving in and out of the quotation marks like crazy. What we can do is put in placeholders for these variables inside the text. So we're not diving in and out of the quotes. We're saying C equals A plus B, which equals placeholder 0, placeholder 1 equals placeholder 2. Close the text off, put in a comma, and then list the variables. And these are going to be, the first variable goes in the first placeholder. Second variable goes in the second placeholder, so on and so forth. This method can be used regardless of the data type. Alright, so it's a lot neater way of writing a output line when you're mixing your text and variables together. It just makes it so much neater. So, did you do the activities from session 2? As in, smallest number out of 2 numbers, the smallest number out of 3, biggest number out of 3. And if you didn't, you better go do them. And if you did, would you rewrite your code after reviewing what's in this presentation? Is there potentially a better way for you to write that programs that you did after the second session? Is there a neater, more efficient way? Hopefully you'll say yes. And through the power of recording, you hit pause, go off and do it, and I'll see you in the next one. No, I said to hit pause and go do it. Alright, so the next class activity to do is to go off and define an array of at least 5 elements, have that input created by the user, display the elements in the array as they were entered, and then display the elements in alphanumeric order. Document your program so that we can see what you're thinking at each step. Part B of your activity is to start thinking about how you would create a testing procedure for developing your code so that your code actually meets the requirements of the project. So have a think about that one. Go off, have a play, produce this set of class activities, and the solutions will be up shortly. Well, solutions, a possible solution. Okay, to summarize this session, we looked at switch. Okay, so session 2, we did the if statements, and switch is an alternative to the if statement type regime. It's a different way of looking at multiple conditions and then executing a block of code. Then we moved into the loops, doing the while and for loops, and a couple of others as a bonus surprise. So, like the do while and for each. So, these basically evaluate a condition, and while that condition is true, they'll continue to do that same block of code until that condition changes to false. We then looked at the commands break and continue and how they can be used within switch and loops to control the outcomes of the blocks. We then looked at how to create arrays, all the various methods of creating it, which are basically the same, just slight variations thereof. And if you want to create or define an array but not put any values in it, how to add values to it later without creating errors. We then went through and re-evaluated how we can output to the console a mixture of text and variables without chopping and changing and adding variables to bits of string to produce an output. And for my students, just a friendly reminder, your Assessment 1 activity paper is now due. So I'd like to thank you for joining me for this session, and until next time, it's bye for me.